So it wasn't for a test. I think it wasn't for like a belt or anything like that. It was just sparring. It was just sparring in Taekwondo, and I got paired up with a woman, and she just happened to be pregnant. And I think
in Taekwondo,
yeah. And I think most people would think, "Oh, did you go easy on her?" And absolutely not.
no.
No, absolutely not.
Why not?
I absolutely destroyed her in the sparring thing. Now we're not allowed to do contact in that anyway. So like we had like padding on. There's like light contact, but no, I kicked her straight in the head and stuff.
But what about her
Some
baby?
people would argue that it was like I was defeating two opponents. So I would say that it was a tougher thing to do, and if anything, it should have counted as a belt rank.
You can get 1.5 at max.
I mean, two opponents, that's a big deal.
I mean, yeah.
I was only like a blue belt at the time.
You think the fetus inside of her really gave her
I
a
think
lot
it
of
gives her
strength?
power. Yeah. Look at what changes in pregnancy. They get stronger and bigger. They're eating more. They're bulking. I mean, they weigh in way heavier, you know?
That's true, yeah.
You can go from a featherweight to heavyweight just from the pregnancy alone.
That's a good point, yeah.
A lot of arguments for why, if you're ever sparring with a pregnant woman, don't feel bad to kick the crap out of her.
Jeez. Well, on that note, welcome to the Back to Basics podcast. Today we are talking about medical legal issues, which actually maybe we should go back to that in terms of fighting pregnant people. But medical legal. So
That's a really boring intro.
I'm sorry.
Couple things. Listen to this episode on Guardian CME, www.guardiancme.com. You can get a free CME for it. It'll be half-hour credit for free. Sign up for an account. They're great. Another announcement, because you're just missing all the announcements. We're going to be at EMS World 2022 next week. So this should come out either the week of or the week before.
Hey,
so come see us. Do we have a booth number?
We do.
We finally have a booth number.
We do finally have a booth number.
So Chris is going to look that up, but I will tell you, if you can't find our booth, we bought a projection light thing that's like the bat signal that's going to shoot the Guardian head up on the ceiling.
We did do that.
The over under on whether or not they're going to allow us to keep this projecting onto the ceiling, because I'm pretty sure you have to pay for advertising space up there, is probably like 20 to 30 minutes. But if you come in the first 20 to 30 minutes, look at the sky, you'll be able to find us.
But what if we just like flash it periodically and then hide it before someone comes around to tell us?
They'll know honestly, it's the coolest thing it's the coolest piece of swag we've ever gotten.
Yeah, it is very cool.
It's a giant bat signal.
Okay, here it is. Our booth number, 1,721.
Ooh.
1721.
Head on down to the slums of EOS 2022. 1,721.
Yep, number 1721.
But no, I will be there. Chris will be there. Jamie, the behind the cameraman, will be there. Come and say hi. We would love to meet you and talk to you and maybe give you a couple free days off the test prep program.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which brings us to our next announcement. Obviously, Back to Basics is sponsored by Guardian Test Prep. If you need to take the NREMT, or you're studying for your exam, or you're in class for EMT or paramedic, check out GuardianTestPrep.com. We specialize in helping people pass the test. So 94% pass rate if you go through our entire program. You got dozens and dozens, thousands really, of questions. You got videos of Chris and I lecturing and a workbook to go through. So lots of fun there. All right. So anyway, wrapping back into what we're doing today, we are going to be talking about medical legal. Not the most exciting topic, but
we're going to make it exciting.
That's important. Yes. And
by testing out each law and seeing how far we can take it.
We're going to bend the rules and therefore teach them to you.
Exactly.
No, I think that this is kind of important though. Like I do see this bump up on the test a lot. Like you'll get a couple medical legal questions. It's kind of boring, like vocabulary, understanding terminology stuff, but it is pretty essential to understanding like what your job is. And I do think that there's a lot of discrepancy with like, well, there's what a lot people really understand about it when they're out there now.
There's a lot of stigma around the legal stuff and like, what am I liable for? What am I not? A lot of things that you think that you are liable for, you're not. You're protected by certain laws, and a lot of things that you maybe don't think that you're liable for, like you are, and you just need to take in consideration. So it is worth knowing the ins and outs of it. And it's not that complicated.
No, it's really not too bad. And that's what I think is going to be clear at the end of this lecture. And we're going to make it fun and exciting for you. So we're titling this, You Can't Handle the Truth, Medical Legal Review.
I love it.
Which is a quote from the movie with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. What's that movie called?
That movie is called Encanto.
Jamie is telling me A Few Good Men.
Yeah.
Which I would bet 94% of our listeners haven't seen, but can quote.
That's true.
Because I'm one of them. Mm-hmm. All right. So first thing, what we want to do is just talk about like what is the purpose of the legal system? What does the legal system do?
What does the legal system do?
What does it do?
The legal system.
Summarize.
That's such a broad question.
I know.
In EMS?
No.
In medicine?
What does
In
it do
general,
in general?
what does the legal system
and then
do?
we're going to relate that to EMS.
Okay. It protects the people of our country.
Yes. Good. It protects you. It's
Yep.
there to protect you, right? It's there to punish criminals and protect innocents, right? And that is why it's there in medicine too. And we need to probably take a little bit more of a positive look about the legal system and realize that like medical law is doing far more at your day-to-day job protecting you than it is like getting you in trouble. And I think that's a
true.
view all the time. So you see how I was tying these points in? You got it.
I
Yeah.
got it.
It's like I have a captive audience and I can see the true reaction. No, what the purpose of this system is to protect you and make sure that you can safely provide good care. Like it is on your side, but I think what happens is in our day-to-day life, we're always like, you got to do this or you'll get in trouble, or like it's not this thing that's constantly trying to sniff out and get you in trouble for doing your job or put limitations on your job. It is there to protect you and make sure that you can.
And it's there to protect your patients,
Yes.
obviously. And I think sometimes we worry that the system's not working for both of those at the same time, and it very much is. I think sometimes we think like, oh, the legal system's there to protect our patients like from us.
Well, which
is not true.
The other thing I was going to bring up is like there's this idea like if in our mindset we're setting ourselves up to be like against the patient in this situation, it's like me versus the patient. I got to make sure that I dot my I's and cross my T's, or this patient's going to get me. Like you are on your patient's side. Like your purpose is to be there for the patient. Like generally speaking, you can probably summarize all of medical legal review up as if you're a decent person and you have your patient's best interests at heart, you're going to be just fine.
Just do your best.
Yeah.
That's it. We can close.
No, but seriously, like
Yeah.
99.9% of the time, like even if you make a mistake, if you're in a court of law and like you're on the hot seat, if your thoughts and intentions and actions were for what you believed was the benefit of the patient, you're going to be just fine.
And some of it, people are going to argue and be like, well, no, what about this case? Yes. The cases you hear about, though, are the ones where like maybe that didn't turn out well. And that's why you're hearing about them.
Right.
You're not hearing about like the millions upon millions of cases that never became cases because these laws are in place.
Yeah.
And the millions of times that the legal system did exactly what it was supposed to do, which was protect the paramedic or EMT or provider and also protect the patient. And what we do hear about, though, is the cases where like, I'm thinking recently there was a case of a nurse who had a bad outcome and was put on trial for it. And like that obviously takes national news, but it's because it's out of the norm. You know what I mean? So I think that.
So this is funny because it's just reminding me of my recent couple of nursing shifts here. So if I can go on a little bit of a tangent, but like, especially in the nursing field, like I feel like there's this fear of like having any type of responsibility for things that's not tied to somebody else's like potential punishment. Like, so recently I was filling out a report. One of my patients had taken a fall on the floor. So I was like filling out the report for it. And I had to basically, they did they did x-rays, they did a CT scan, they did all this stuff. And I was like filling it out and I was typing in to the doctor, a note to the doctor. And I was just like, hey, like the results are back. Like, I don't see any issues, but if you could please review this. And my charge nurse was like, oh, don't put that. Don't put that you don't see any issues. Because that's going to like tie it to you sort of thing. And I just like,
It's my patience.
Like
So, like-
and it's also like, it's like a fear to practice medicine. Like I'm not saying he's 100% good. I'm saying based on my nursing judgment and assessment, like,
And could that
I
be-
read this paperwork and I interpret it this way. If the doctor decides to take that as, you know, the holy word of God and there's mistakes or whatever, he's going to get in trouble for that anyway. That's not going to be on me, but
everyone
don't be
is.
afraid to do your job.
The thing is
Like,
that if there's a bad outcome, then everyone caring for the patient is going to be somewhat liable. Like it's your patient.
Right.
So if you're not willing to take liability and responsibility for your patient, then don't work in the medical field. I mean, like that's like part of it's like the whole with great power comes great responsibility, right? Like and these laws are there to protect us and do that. Another thing I'll throw in there is I think sometimes we think about like malpractice insurance, right? Like everyone, even if you're an EMT, you have malpractice insurance through your employer, that sort of thing. I think people look at that as a bad thing too. Like I had a clinic that one of our sister companies, Guardian Medical Direction, we were providing oversight for the clinic, and the owner said, well, I was told not to get malpractice insurance for my clinic because that way there's nothing for them to go after. And it's like, the purpose of malpractice insurance is to protect you and the patient. If there is a poor outcome, money can't really fix that, but it can go to help like deal with the like, I want that for my I want to carry malpractice insurance so that if my patients do need to access that, right, through a lawsuit, they can get it without me having, like, I feel like sometimes you read the newspaper too and you're like, oh, so-and-so was sued and, they had to pay out millions of malpractice. It's like, yeah, that's not a bad thing. That's exactly what it's there for. What didn't happen is that they didn't have to pay millions of dollars out of their own pocket, or two, that the patient never had access to ongoing medical services that they needed because they couldn't afford it. I mean, like that's not a bad thing to have happened.
Right. And I just feel like that's all the stories. We always get like the malpractice and like when mistakes are made and it's everybody's fault and whose fault is it? And like in this particular case, like I was like, as a nurse, assessing the patient with nursing knowledge and then presenting that knowledge. Like that knowledge, maybe that doctor has different knowledge or he interprets that in a different way. Like you're not in trouble for just doing your job and interpreting that the way you want. Like you're never like signing this seal saying like anything that happens to the patient, I am now taking responsibility for forever. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's just it's not that deep. Like you do the best you can with what you know and you present that information honestly.
And I would hope that the nurse, as a physician, I would hope that the nurse caring for my patients when I'm not there would take the responsibility of like, I'm looking at this as well, as opposed to just like, I'll just transfer this to doctor. Like I can get anybody to do that.
Right.
I'll just get Joe Schmo off the street to come and babysit and send me the reports if that's all I need. And that's not the point, right? I mean, like you have a level of training that like,
well, I'm supposed to be a stopgap for you to help you catch something that you might miss or something like that. So if I just, what's the point of me if I'm just passing stuff, right?
Exactly,
so anyway, it just kind of made me think of that. But don't be so scared. Stop being scaredy cats out there. Cut it out.
That's the message.
Hey,
knock it off.
Cut it out.
Knock it off.
So that would be a good, like, we'll cut that now as a TikTok and we'll like make it a whole like political thing or something. All right.
Political. Why are we going to make it political?
Because everything goes political now. And,
okay, you're really political on TikTok. That's going to be our new social media strategy moving forward. I like it. Perfect.
So let's overview some terminology. All right. This part's going to be a little weird because we're going to go over like some general terms, but we're going to try to go through them quick. All right. So first of all, yes.
Law.
I don't know if I can define what a law is. Please don't do that to me. Scope of practice. So your scope of practice is the like jurisdiction you have to work within, right? So if you're a paramedic, you have a paramedic scope of practice. It means that you can't go and perform heart surgery. It means that you can do what you are trained to do and what you are certified / licensed to do, and also allowed to do by your like your overseeing body, right? And this is where things get funky because a medic in Canada or a medic in Michigan or a medic in Ohio might all have slightly different scopes of practice. They might have equal training and the same licensure and certification, but because of the area that they're operating in, their scope of practice is different.
And this is interesting too, because scope of practice is not always well defined. And we see, and this is where you will see the medical legal stuff start to weigh in, is that like there are certain things that certain areas are within the scope of practice of a paramedic or a nurse or a physician. And then there are other areas where they are not. And sometimes it is very gray. And then if there is a bad outcome, the big question that will always start is, was this within their scope of practice?
Yeah, were they allowed to do this legally?
And this is something that I would encourage everyone listening, like take the time to do the research for your area, your region, whatever, your hospital, whatever it is. Figure out how they are defining your scope of practice, because it will give you that is always going to be the first question. If there ever is like a medical legal case, it always starts with, was what that provider what they were doing, was it within their scope of practice? And that has to be, and sometimes it's very clear yes or no. If it's no, then like that's a problem. But if it's not clearly defined, getting clarification from your overseeing body or your, that type of thing is not a bad idea. So.
And I think the easiest way to do this is just consult your protocols. Like that's what protocols are there to define your scope of practice. So local protocols will be based off of state protocols, their interpretation and specifics that they want to take from that. So consult your local protocols, know those well, follow those protocols. That's why it's always so important to fall back on protocol, because it's making sure that you're staying within your scope of practice.
I had a guy tell me once that in Oklahoma, as long as you know how to do an IV, anyone can do an IV. That's true. That's a true story. That was he and he was looking to get a medical director. And I was like, you should look somewhere else.
Not with us, please.
I was like, well, you mean like as a nurse or as a paramedic? He's like, no, as long as you're comfortable, as long as you can do it.
Yeah.
As long as you can do it.
I feel that way about a lot of things in medicine. Just, I feel like I could crack his chest.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your confidence level has to be about a 6.
Yeah, exactly.
So, cool. So that's what scope of practice is. Now, medical direction is the next thing that I wanted to define. So medical direction is basically like, we did a whole episode on, we did an episode on DNRs, which heavily talked about.
Did we do a medical direction as well?
Yeah, we did a medical direction episode. So check that one out. I don't know what episode number it is.
It was like
check it out.
3 or 4. Is it early?
It was early on, I think. But anyway, medical direction is essentially like the person who's like ultimately responsible for who's like licensure or.
So let's put it this way: no paramedic or EMT can work without some type of oversight.
So we're considered dependent providers is what that means.
Yeah. So they have to have some type of physician oversight. In the hospital healthcare system, that falls under the medical director or medical direction, which is essentially like which physician or physicians are ultimately responsible for writing those protocols, for setting the, standing orders and defining the scope of practice for that region, that area.
Right. And so what's funny is that there needs to be laws in place that even allow someone like you to do that for someone like me, right? So you have what's called the Medical Practice Act that gives authorization to physicians to delegate tasks. So there has to be a law in place that says like, hey, Chris as a doc can tell Jason as a medic within his scope of practice to do this thing for him.
And only in certain circumstances. So like there are a lot, every state is very different too. So like there may be a limit to how many people I can delegate authority to. There may be a limit of what types of things I can delegate versus what I cannot. There, like in some states, like I can delegate, Botox injections to a nurse who's trained. And there are some states where I cannot delegate that. That's not allowed. So it's very defined by that.
Right. And that's where we get an interesting take here because our sister company, Guardian Medical Direction, Chris sits as the head medical director for that. Chief medical director. What is the official title?
Medical officer.
Chief medical officer of the. Did you just make that up though?
Yeah. No, that's really what it is.
So he's like the medical director over all the medical directors. So he has a lot of liability there, but he is very familiar with.
But I love the liability because the legal system's awesome.
Yes, there you go.
Yep.
No, but he's very familiar with, like you were saying, everything bumps into that scope of practice. So like, hey, I can delegate this, but I can't do that across the board. It all depends on that person, that specific individual, where they're at in their individual scope of practice.
Well, so and the reason where it's coming up right now for me on that side of things with paramedics is, can paramedics do IV hydration? Can they start IV hydration clinics? Mm-hmm. And it starts with, well, is that within their scope of practice? Can I delegate as a physician that authority in the state type of thing? So that's where I'm seeing it on the paramedic side. And like IVs are very much in your scope of practice as a paramedic, pretty much anywhere, but in the context of providing emergent care. So then you're looking at the laws and you're saying, well, this is in the context of an emergent care. What if it's not emergent care, right? Like if I'm going to hook somebody up to an IV because then all of a sudden you're defining emergent. So it can get kind of, just have to like.
Paramedics, EMTs were initially designed obviously as emergency medical providers, but that is changing and shifting a little bit, especially with nursing shortages and stuff like that. Yeah, you're starting to see community paramedicine. You're starting to see paramedics work on floors now as like nurse assistants, but like with a little bit more authority. So there's a lot of, it all depends on that local area. So it can really shift and change, which is interesting. So we're seeing that practice grow quite a bit.
And I think exciting. I think because sometimes people will hear that and be like, oh man, this is super complicated. That means I'm going to get sued. It's like, no, it just means you need to really talk about it and like define it well with a lot, like talk to the medical board, talk to the nursing board. You know what I mean? Like these different groups, they're there to help as well. You know what I mean? So again, like just making sure you're having conversation. And this is why we want to talk about it today, is that like not knowing is more dangerous. If you know, then you can, and I'm not going to say this in a bad way, but like find a workaround or find a way to do it compliantly or legally, or decide, that's just something I cannot do. And then, so
now,
the more you know,
and knowing is half the battle.
Exactly.
G.I. Joe.
Yep. Perfect. That
trademark G.I. Joe.
Yeah.
For medical legal purposes, I need to say copyright G.I. Joe. I don't own that.
We don't own any copyright laws too. We don't own any copyright to G.I. Joe.
Okay. Awesome.
If they would like to be a sponsor on the podcast, though, please reach out to us at.
We're already having way too much fun because I have like 18 terms we have to go through.
Sorry.
So, all right, next. Vicarious liability. This is online medical direction. Vicarious means like if you're living vicariously through somebody, you are like witnessing and experiencing those things through another person, right? So if my nephew goes out and has a party and I'm like, oh, I got to vicariously live through you, tell me all about how the party went. Like that's where you see that in a social.
And me as a medical director would be like, oh my gosh, tell me how you want to deviate from your protocol and I'll tell you if I'm cool with it or not.
Exactly. So vicarious liability allows Chris to basically accept liability to tell me to
breach protocol.
Don't say breach. Deviate from protocol is different than breaching because you still have to do something within your scope of practice. Like a doctor can't get on online medical direction and be like, I'm going to walk you through cracking somebody's chest. Like
that doesn't make any sense. I've seen that on every show I've ever watched about EMS.
But you can't do that. That is outside of a paramedic scope of practice.
I need to go make a few phone calls.
And I would argue possibly sometimes in these shows out of the physician's scope of practice because Chris has to stick to what he can do as an ER physician. I
can't delegate tasks that I can't do myself. Right. I'm like, you know what? We're going to do heart surgery. I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to show you how to do it and delegate.
And a medical license doesn't give you authority to practice all medicine at all times.
Correct.
You can't just walk into radiology and be like, you know what? I'm picking up a shift.
Right.
You have to be able to work within that scope. So vicarious liability is what allows a physician to give online medical direction to deviate from standard protocols within the scope of practice.
And we've talked about this.
Instead of, giving nitro right now because of this particular state, let's withhold on nitro. He can give me online medical direction to do that with vicarious liability. He's accepting liability.
And that's what I was saying. Like the online medical direction, like you don't have to make a phone call every time you see a patient because you have protocols and standards. Online medical direction is when you do have a question or when you do want to deviate that you put in a call.
Then there's also something called borrowed servants liability, which is like when a paramedic is over an EMT. So I don't have a whole lot of experience with this because the county that I worked the majority of my career in has been, well, I get it allows paramedic EMT partners, but I've always worked with another paramedic ALS partner. So, but if you have an EMT that you're overseeing and they're like taking lead on the call, there are some legal, not ramifications, but there's just some legal concerns that you need to have.
You have some responsibility.
You have responsibility for what that EMT is doing, and that is called borrowed servants liability.
Right.
So you're overseeing that EMT technically.
Anytime you're treating a patient and have more training than the person you're working with, you have some responsibility, we'll call it, to, guide that.
Yeah. So, and one thing to just point out is that an EMT and a paramedic working together is not interdisciplinary care. It's not like you giving a report to a nurse. Like you don't really know what their deal is. Like you guys have separate liabilities and separate scopes. Like they are within your scope. You need to be familiar with their scope because you have some shared liability there. That's all.
Correct.
So licensure versus certification. So I get this a lot, actually. Like people are very confused about the difference between certification and licensure. Certification is basically just like anyone could give anyone a certification. If you are considered a certifying body or like a self-considered expert, like you can just certify someone in something. So
it's whether or not that certification is recognized by...
Right.
Which, I mean, we even seen the largest certifying bodies, like the American Red Cross versus the American Heart Association. Yeah. There are hospital systems who have said, no, I don't want to recognize the certification from the American Heart Association. I want to recognize it from the Red Cross or vice versa. And then there are hospital systems being like, hey, I don't care where you got your CPR training. As long as you have a certificate, it works. Right. But like it's again, a certificate.
So that's another thing too. Like we see with a lot of the CPR agencies that we work with our sister company, Guardian IT Marketing, like I feel like I'm a paramedic or I'm a nurse, I'm going to certify people in CPR. It's not AHA. It's not Red Cross. It's not ASHE. I'm just going to like Jason CPR. You get a Jason CPR certification. Like
sure.
You can do that. Like you can just like write a cert and make it up yourself. Like, hey, you're certified now. It's just whether or not people are going to recognize your certifying body yourself as being legit or not. Right. So difference between a cert and a license. A license is basically it gives you occupational regulation. So
it defines a scope of practice. A license, right. What a license does is gives you the framework for a scope of practice, essentially.
In medicine.
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So a license, like if you're a licensed paramedic, it's giving you occupational regulation. There's occupational regulation within that. That's the difference between the license and the cert.
And that's going to be on a state level and national level. There's going to be some recognition of the licensure.
And that's where it gets weird is certification granted by a state that allows you to engage in trade or profession is a license. So when you say I'm a certified paramedic or I'm a certified EMT, you're also a licensed EMT or a licensed paramedic if you're practicing.
Because that's coming through the state. Yes. Because it's coming through like the governing body, not jasoncpr.com.
Gotcha. Yep. I can't certify you as a paramedic. I mean, I guess I could just pretend like you're like,
try.
there's like a Jason's paramedic certification, but it would not allow you to practice
Right.
with a license
Correct.
because it's not regulated by the state.
So
And it
this is
doesn't
something
mess
that
with
we
your
do hear a
occupation.
lot of times too, like especially in the CPR world. Like just because you have a CPR cert doesn't mean that like you can just willy-nilly go practice all the things you learned in CPR class.
So we'll
Which is
talk about
true.
that when we talk about Good Samaritan laws too, but we'll get into that.
Well, no, I just mean that like even like in a lot of like CPR, like in a BLS course,
Yeah, that's true.
they
'Cause
learn
it's-
how to use BVMs and all this different kind of stuff.
Basic life support.
Unless you have a license to use those tools and practice that way, all you can do is chest compressions and mouth to mouth. Like you can't, you know what I mean? Like technically, like that doesn't actually give you, if it's not also in a licensed scope of practice.
Yes. Yeah, no. And I think where we run into a lot of trouble here, like when I was in EMT school, I was an EMT. I took an ACLS course to try to get ready for paramedic. There's dozens of things in ACLS that an EMT can't do. And I would also argue there are things in ACLS that a paramedic can't do. There's lab values and things that you like, it doesn't really relate to your practice.
Or
So
like
just something
nurses
to
who
consider.
take advanced cardiac life support or pediatric advanced life support, like they don't have now permission to intubate or push meds or do different
Exactly.
things that are not already in, that has to
Right.
be in your scope of practice.
Right. So cool. Moving on from there, a duty to act. So what is a duty to act?
Well, I think that just goes back to the responsibility piece. Like if you're trained to do something and you've been licensed to do something, like you have a responsibility to use those skills for the betterment of
On duty.
when you're
And that's the thing is there's a big difference. Like I don't have a duty to act when I'm walking down the street and I see an emergency happen. I may want to help out, but if I help out, I need to make sure I'm helping out in a capacity within my scope of practice when I'm off duty. And my scope of practice is different when I'm off duty than versus when I'm on duty. When I'm on duty and I have a duty to act, I have the tool belt, I have everything that I need. I have to act. It's required to act. Not acting is a breach of your duty to act. So you never have a duty to act off shift. Chris doesn't, when someone yells on a plane, is there a doctor on board? Chris does not have a duty to act to be like, yes, I'm a doctor and like help out in any way. Doesn't have to do that. And if he decides to help out, he can't be like, I'm pushing Versed.
Well, it's the physician's a bad example because I'm able to operate without any oversight. You know what I mean? So like technically I can go do those things in my malpractice.
Yeah, I suppose so.
May cover it depending on how my malpractice is set up. But for a paramedic, like if you respond off duty and you intubate and push meds, you are not covered by the medical director or the medical direction that is set forth. And you're not allowed to practice medicine without that medical oversight. So technically you're outside of your scope of practice.
And there's some nuances here, and this is why it's really important to know. Like 90% of America is volunteer fire departments and volunteer EMS agencies. So this is important to know too. Is like there are different laws dictating like what makes you on duty versus what makes you off duty. Like if I went and visited the guys at work right now and they told me hop on the ambulance, I need help with something, and I pushed a med. Depending on kind of like how those laws are written and how like your individual scope is written. So like there are volunteer, I don't want to say that like it's a black and white rule because there's volunteers out there that like, they don't necessarily have a duty to act, but if they act, they can like turn themselves on duty because they're volunteers. So it's like a whole kind of weird thing, but just something to consider. Your duty to act is,
but you can't be
whether or
on
not you're
duty. You
required.
can't be on duty and be like, no, I don't want to be liable for this patient. It's like, too bad, you're on duty.
What you can do on duty is say that is outside of my scope of practice. I'm not going to do that thing. But you can't be like, I'm not treating this patient. I'm not feeling it today.
Yeah, and you can't say that about something that is in your scope of practice.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
So a couple things. Once a paramedic or an EMT assumes a duty to act, they have to continue to like carry out that duty until one of three things happen. The patient's transferred to someone of equal licensure or higher. The patient no longer needs care, and that's clear. Or the patient ends up ending the patient-caregiver relationship. So they can refuse, you can drop them off at a facility or turn them over to another provider, or you healed them.
Once you choose to act, you cannot make the decision to stop acting until it's an appropriate time.
Otherwise, you would see abandonment, which this is another thing that we have to do. It's like down here, we're at E right now. It's K, but we're just going to cover it right now. Abandonment is when you you have a duty to act, you initiate acting, and then you leave. Mm-hmm. Okay. Standard of care. Standard of care is kind of like I don't want to say it's subjective because it's not supposed to be, but the standard of care is basically like what a prudent person in your field would do. So if in a court of law, they can be like, hey, Jason, like, I understand that you performed a tracheotomy with a straw. A sane, normal person wouldn't have done that in your position. So that is outside of the standard of care. And in that case, that would be negligent, and we'll kind of define.
And the reason we even talk about standard of care is because we cannot, in protocols and standing orders, cover everything in medicine, right? So a lot falls under like, is this standard practice or standard of care across, again, like your license, your jurisdiction, your area, that type of thing.
Well, what did we say when we summed up this whole episode at the beginning? Be nice, keep your patient's best interest at heart, and you're going to be just fine. Like this is where like a lot of that falls into that, right?
Yeah.
So like, hey, as long as I'm doing my best for this patient and I'm doing what a reasonable paramedic would, I should be good to go. So
like it might be in your scope of practice to like push epinephrine during cardiac arrest, but like pushing epinephrine when someone is like, you know, feeling a little sleepy and you haven't checked vital signs is like very much not standard of care, right? It's in your scope of practice, but it's not standard of care.
pushing epinephrine is in your scope of practice, but it's the standard of care isn't using it in that instance.
Exactly, right.
All right, so let's talk about misfeasance, malfeasance, and nonfeasance. Misfeasance is performing a legal act that is harmful or injurious. So misfeasance is doing what you just said. It's illegal for me to give epinephrine, but I gave it
At a time would
at
be
a
harmful.
time when it would be harmful, right?
it.
So legal act, but it ends up being harmful or injurious. I'm sorry, it is harmful or injurious. Malfeasance is performing a wrongful or unlawful act. This would be me like cracking a chest open or like doing something completely outside of
Standard
my
of care
scope.
or scope of
Right.
practice, yeah.
And then nonfeasance is not performing an act when you are required. When you're required, when you have a duty to act, right? So when you're on duty or whatever. So misfeasance, malfeasance, and nonfeasance.
And nonfeasance would be like, you should have started CPR and you didn't.
Yes, exactly. And so I'll give an example. Misfeasance. There was a case recently where someone was starting like hugely high large bore IVs on patients just for shits and giggles. We're gonna have to bleep that out. Sorry, for craps and giggles. And they got in trouble for that. That would be misfeasance. Is it legal to start a
Large bore
large
IV.
bore IV? Yes, not in this particular case. It was harmful
And can
So-
cause harm, yeah.
yeah. So malfeasance, performing a wrongful or unlawful act. This would be like,
These are all also that do harm, right? Like by not acting or by doing these things that are lawful or unlawful, they cause harm.
yeah.
So what if you did something unlawful that does not cause harm?
We're going to talk about negligence in the next section.
I love it.
We'll get there. All right. That covers it. We're fine. Damages. What are damages?
The bad outcomes.
The harm, right? So there's compensable damages and then there's punitive damages. So compensable damage is like, you're compensating for the damage. So I broke your neck and it cost you
Everything, Jason. It cost me everything.
So there you go. It cost you $15,000 to get it corrected, right? I owe that in compensable like wages basically. But then the court might also be like, because of the emotional damages, like the punitive, like we're also going to tack on another 60 grand because this took them out of work or whatever, right? So the courts decide like what's compensable versus what's punitive, but they are totally allowed to not just be like, hey, it's even Stevens now, you're good to go, right? Like they can add that punitive damage. A statute of limitations is the amount of time someone can file a lawsuit. So after like a certain amount of time, someone can't like call you and be like, in 1985, Jason broke my wrist. I want damages now. So there's usually a statute of limitations of about, for some reason, 3 years is sticking in my head, but I think that is just the time at my department where if you get written up, that goes away.
I think 2 years is
And
pretty.
I know that because I crashed an ambulance. And then the chief was like, remember when you crashed that ambulance? I was like, you're not allowed to remember that. It was over 3 years ago. So, but anyway, there's a statute of limitations on laws. I'm going to throw this one in there. Double jeopardy is you can't be tried twice for the same crime.
So if you break my neck and they found out that you didn't have anything to do with it and nothing happened, I can't later with new evidence try you for the same issue.
I don't know if that...
I think if you have new evidence, that maybe you can.
I don't really know how that works. And also, double jeopardy might be something that's only in criminal law. I don't know
Could
for
be.
sure. Anyway, false imprisonment. This is imprisoning someone when you're not allowed to. Let me tell you this just very clearly. You're not allowed to imprison anyone in your job. So
Right.
don't do
Not
that.
in your scope of practice.
Right. So, but also understand that you are imprisoning someone if you force them to go to the hospital into your ambulance with restraints and they haven't agreed to it if they are of sound mind and meet some criteria, which we'll talk about. Abandonment, we already covered. Assault is the intent to do harm on someone. So this is where people like mix up assault and battery all the time. You've assaulted someone if you threaten. Battery is actually doing it, right? So if you're someone who sticks to their guns, assault and battery. If you're just a wimp that's just all talk,
This is assault.
assault. And then we can move on to our next section. So that covers terminology. It's going to be a long one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, let's talk negligence. What is negligence?
I don't know.
Negligence is, is basically, in order for negligence to happen, we talk about gross negligence versus just standard negligence and all this stuff. What negligence is basically whether or not you're responsible for harm to the patient. And a few things have to exist in order for you to be negligent or responsible. To have
So
been
negligence is a legal term basically defining whether or not I can even be at fault for an outcome.
Correct.
Like there has to have been negligence.
They have
and
to prove
negligence
that
is
the person was
defined
negligent.
a
Yes.
certain. Okay, go ahead.
So duty to act has to exist.
So if I have no duty to act because I'm off duty,
And I walk right
you
by an
cannot sue me
emergency.
for negligence. I didn't
Yeah.
do anything wrong. Cool.
Like the story of the Samaritan. If you cross the road and just keep crossing, no duty to act there.
Nobody cares.
I'll argue that you're kind of a jerk, but if a duty to act didn't exist,
But you can't sue
can't
me.
be negligent. All right. Breach of duty. So the actions performed had to have deviated from the standard of care. So this is where you have to prove that, hey,
So
what's the
not only-
standard? So like they would normally, a normal paramedic would follow protocols and they would follow it to this degree. This is what a normal, prudent, sane paramedic would do.
You're fine.
Yeah, if you did that, then you're fine. If they deviated outside of that, then we have an issue.
So first question, was there duty to act? If yes, did they deviate from standard of care? If no, you're fine still.
Correct. Damage to the patient has to have occurred. So you can have a duty to act, breach that duty, but no harm, no foul, you're good to go.
Cool.
Legitimately.
Yeah.
Like that's the big difference. And that's pretty important in terms of like defending yourself. Like if you make a mistake, but it didn't cause harm to the patient, you're good to go. And then lastly, the breach has to have caused the damage. So like it has to, damage could have ensued. Like let's take the break your neck example, right? So I have a duty to act. I act. There's a breach of duty. I do something wrong with the patient transfer, right? You break your neck, but you can't prove that the way I transferred you is what broke your neck. I'm good to go. So the breach of duty has to have caused the harm. And what we call that is proximate cause. There has to be proximate cause. In order
And
for
this
that.
becomes like when cases are brought to governing bodies, like these become the questions they ask. First of all, was there a duty or not? Second of all, was this within their scope of practice? Was this standard of care or not? And that's where you'll see people start to argue. Like, I think it was, you know, that kind of thing. Then, like I said, was there breach?
even damage?
Was there any damage to the patient? And patients are going to argue like, well, there was because of this, and then it's going to go back and forth. And then also, finally, like,
Is what they did
is what I
cause it.
did. Yeah, like maybe that person did have damages, but that's not because of the thing I did. Type thing.
So those four things have to be in place in order for you to be negligent. And a lot of times that breach caused the damage, that proximate cause piece is like the linchpin in a lot of defenses for you as a provider. So let's jump into other examples of EMS related laws covering Good Samaritan laws. So Good Samaritan laws are not for on-duty personnel. Good Samaritan laws exist to encourage citizens to help others, and I'm quoting, in good faith, in a manner similarly trained person would.
Standard of care. So if you're off duty and you want to help someone and you're going to do within your scope of practice like you would normally, there are laws that specifically protect you in that instance so that you don't just cross the road and leave the person there.
Good Samaritan laws were originally designed for off-duty nurses to be able to perform CPR. And then what ended up happening was it got expanded out. And the idea behind it was for specific CPR emergencies when someone goes into cardiac arrest, whether or not you should render care. So if I start doing CPR on you and I break your ribs, that's a very, I shouldn't say common, but it can be a common like side effect of doing CPR on somebody. You can't wake up and be like, I'm suing you because you broke my ribs. There's damages there, right? So if we didn't have Good Samaritan laws in place, no one would ever do CPR ever because they'd be worried about liability.
Right.
So it removes you from liability so long as you help others in good faith in a manner a similarly trained person would, which would be falling onto your CPR certification training, which is basic stuff. Like even Chris said, like the BVM stuff. And when we start adding medical equipment that's more for advanced providers, like a basic life support class or an advanced cardiac life support, that's out of that kind of scope of practice that a Good Samaritan law would cover. There are exposure laws. I'm blanking on the name of this, but there's a law that basically says if I'm exposed to like your blood as a paramedic, I can get you Jacob's law. I think I can make sure you get tested or I get tested. Like I can force you to be tested essentially outside of your will. Like so that I can see if you had a yucky disease.
Right. Well, and it's because testing that person's blood is not harmful to them, and it could be harmful for you to not know and not get treatment that you might need. So yeah.
Like that happened. Remember when I was in paramedic clinicals and I was working at the hospital that you were a resident at, and you decided to have me assist with the central line, and you pulled the line out, and then a bunch of blood spurted out into my eyes, and you didn't tell me to get glasses. And then I went to the wash station, and you're like, I think it's over there. And I was like, I think something needs to be done. I wasn't even supposed to be on this floor. I'm supposed to be in the ER.
I don't recall
and you
that.
were like, let's not worry about it.
I don't recall that because that sounds like negligence to me. And oh, look at this. I've been out of residency long enough that the statute of limitations says that you can't bring that up right now.
There you go. That did happen.
No, it didn't.
And the patient had a bunch of like super bugs that were like, they're like antibiotic resistant drugs or drug diseases, which is kind of spooky. But then you told me everything's fine. I never saw the report based on our previous interactions. I'm not sure. But I remember calling my clinical coordinator and being like, so good news and bad news. And he's like, what's the good news? I was like, the good news is I got some great experience off the floor.
You're welcome.
Bad news is I'm not allowed to be off the floor, and I definitely was. But we were covered. It was good.
I don't recall that.
Pretty funny stuff. If you laugh at me almost dying. All right. So exposure laws, like legally, if that guy refused, I could have like forced him to, I couldn't have, but like the hospital could have forced him to get tested so that they could protect
did.
me.
We just tested the blood because I don't remember. I don't remember the incident. I don't remember the incident. I'm not sure you're talking about.
All right. Jumping over to confidentiality, HIPAA. Oh gosh, I'm going to butcher HIPAA. It's the health Information Portability and Accountability Act.
Yes.
Nailed it. This protects a patient's privacy. So it is within the patient's right not to advertise that they have a condition or disease outside of the people that would be taking care of them.
And you're not allowed to go tell people.
Yeah, you can't go and be like in that story I just told, I couldn't be like, that guy's name was Gary Johnson or whatever, right?
His birth date was this, and he had.
And there are actually, like, we have to be careful with a lot of the stories that we share here. There are particular things that can only be like shared or talked about in an educational sense, even when you're not bringing a name into it. So just
and you also have to be careful too, because like sometimes the events surrounding something are public knowledge enough that you could like figure out who the person was, or if you know what I mean. So you have to like be careful in how you share. Just don't share patient information.
Yeah, if you're like, rhymes with Bo K. Jimson. That's not going to do enough, right? Okay. Defamation. You're good at this.
What?
No, defamation is basically when you are making someone's reputation look bad, either in writing or verbally. So if it's in writing, it's considered libel. And if it's in
speech,
if it's in speech, then it's slander. So if I say something nasty about someone that is not definitively true, it's subjective, and it's like a defamation of their character. It's turning people off to them. You can.
And this actually comes into play in medical records
all the time.
So if you are writing you're writing your HPI and you're speaking ill of the person in their history, the next provider who reads that, like that can be considered a slander, like, or libel type of thing.
Yeah, you can't be like,
this guy was a jerk and he's horrible and his wife left him. And
in your EHR and stuff like that, you need to report things like the patient said this. Like if you want to paint that picture in the correct way, it needs to be the patient said this, quote, go back there and die, you mother effing blah, 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 right? Like you need to write that out as opposed to being like, he was really mean or he was rude to the parent. Like you got to be careful with that language. Because,
and you have to think about it too. And I'll bring some empathy into this, that like we see people at their worst when they're in pain, when they're like, so their best foot's probably not being put forward. And we have to be careful that we don't paint a picture, like, because you guys have done this too, where you like read a patient's chart and you're like, oh, this guy, and then I come in biased with and that's not fair. Like I wouldn't want that for me. Like I'm sure that like if I'm ever in a severe amount of pain or hospital, like, or scared or whatever, like, I'm probably not going to be putting my best self forward.
Right.
I'd prefer to be able to get another chance. And I feel like that's kind of the way we have to approach that piece. So.
Yeah. I mean, don't take crap. Like, don't be treated poorly or like harmed in any way or anything like that. But just understand that how you package that information later, especially those are the things that a lot of times like providers want to talk about afterwards, because maybe it was funny to them now looking back at it, or maybe it was just interesting or it upset them or whatever. We just have to be careful how we package that information, because really, even if you're going to another member of your organization, if they weren't directly involved in that patient's care, you shouldn't really be talking about them at all. And if you're talking about them with the intent to have a social conversation about the funny thing that happened or the mean thing that happened, that breaks HIPAA anyway.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to do with their care. All right. Lastly, in this section, crime scene evidence protection. So just keep in mind, like, medical legal falls into crime scene stuff. So we need to make sure that we're keeping the chain of evidence going. So this takes place in like sexual assaults or any like murders, assault and battery, things like that. Like, we need to be careful that we're not interrupting the police's process in solving that crime. So there are things that you'll have to do. Your protocols will outline those. A lot of times, like with, we discussed this briefly in our STD episode when we talked about sexual abuse. Like, you want to package that clothing, don't allow the patient to shower. Like, there's specific things that need to happen in order to gain evidence. We've had like crime scenes where it's like, it's not like you don't like pick up the knife and like put it in a brown paper bag and like that's not your job to handle that evidence. So just be careful and work with the police that are on scene. There have been times like I was doing CPR on a guy one time and like a gun fell out of his pocket. And I was like, you got to secure that gun for me. You know what I mean? So they like moved that. It wasn't a crime, but so their job is first and foremost to keep you safe. But then outside of that, we want to make sure that we preserve that evidence so that we can have justice for the victims. Resuscitation. We have a whole lecture on DNRs and advanced directives, and I would recommend that you take a look at that one and get your CE for it.
Let's not even go into that.
Yeah, durable power of attorney versus a do not resuscitate order. They're different things. Living wills and the right to die with dignity. Those are all factors that come into that. We talk about that a lot when we have our DNR episode, so check that out. I believe that's like episode, I think it's like 4 or 5, to be honest with you, but could be completely wrong. And we did it here, didn't we? So it would have been like, we did it in our new studio, so it might be a little bit later than that. But check it out. Look it up, DNR, back to basics. Organ donation. So there's depending on your situation, like when you resuscitate someone, if they're an organ donor, there might be some special protocols that you have to do. That's more in hospital than in the field. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about today is consent. So types of consent. When consent is basically
our
whether
favorite topic.
Consent is whether or not someone agrees to the medical care that you are going to provide them. So there is informed consent, which is I'm
like, hey, I'm gonna put this IV, and you're like, all right, cool, thanks.
Yes, and you are of sound mind, and you've been informed, you understand it, and you consent to that. There's express consent, like Chris is grasping at his throat and can't breathe. I can say that's express consent for me to do the Heimlich on him, right? Also, anyone who's unconscious or dead, you can consider to be express consent to work on them, do something about it. That isn't express consent. That's implied consent.
Yeah.
Express consent is like a living will or something like that, where they've expressed it in a different way. So they're not necessarily informed, but they give express consent, like do these things, or this person can act for me. So like if I go down and like if I've made Natalie my durable power of attorney, medical attorney, my wife then can like make medical decisions for me. I've given express consent that she can do that. Implied consent, is the I'm unconscious. There's an implication of consent because you're unconscious or something, and what would a prudent person want? They'd want to survive. So we do something about that. And then there's involuntary consent, and this is where it gets real like medical legal involved. So involuntary consent, there's like basically like 3 big places that you're going to see this: with minors, with adults without decisional capacity, and with prisoners or arrestees. So with minors, they cannot consent for themselves in terms of medical care. So unless they're emancipated. So an emancipated minor would be someone who was able to achieve that because they left their parents, or a lot of times like females that are pregnant before 18 can become emancipated minors. They can make decisions for themselves and their baby. But
what's interesting about that is a whole different topic, but technically a minor who's pregnant is able to make all decisions for her unborn child, but still cannot technically make decisions outside of that pregnancy for herself.
Yes.
Unless she's legally gone and become an emancipated minor.
Correct.
Which is very
But it's
hard
very
to
easy.
navigate.
I think it's very easy to become an emancipated minor. If you're
No, I'm saying it's very hard to navigate as a provider.
Oh, yeah.
I've had it happen where I was just like, I don't know how to do this.
So like grandparents or something are like trying to decide what happens with the daughter, but the daughters are trying to decide.
Well, no, like
what's
the
happening
parents
with the-
are trying to decide what happens to the daughter.
That's
Well,
what
I
I'm
mean,
saying, grandparents of the baby.
yeah, grandparents, but then like she gets to make all the decisions for the baby, though.
yeah.
It's like very,
Yeah, that can be tough. Not a whole lot that we have to deal with, like deliver the baby if it's coming out, and
yeah.
And here's what's fun. I don't know if it's fun, but here's what's like great about this is like you have someone like Chris that you can give a call. We talk a lot about this when we talk about DNRs and we talk about medical direction. When we talk a lot about these nuances, like communicate with your ER. If you feel like you're in the gray or there's like a fuzzy area that you don't understand, get online medical direction on what to do. Like give them a call.
Also, just communicate with your patients. Like, even when it comes to like the involuntary like consent stuff, like you know how many like prisoners have come into the ER who like didn't want anything, and I just had a real conversation around like, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's what I need to do. We can get you out of here. And then they're like, all right, cool. You know what I mean? Like, or just you treat people like human beings. Like, I even think about the one case I had of this minor who was pregnant. Like, I just had a real conversation with her, and then also her parents. Like, hey, can we just all like work together? And it works out fine. I mean, it's
again, be nice. Do what a prudent person would do and do the best you can for your patient. You're probably going to be fine.
We could have ended
There have been a lot of people who have told me like, no, when I've initially walked into their house. And then like 5 minutes later, I'm like, but can we? And they're like, yeah. So it's just, they want to prove to them that you're there for them.
Yeah.
And,
that they have a voice, that they have a say in it. So
yeah. So adults without decisional capacity would be like someone with a developmental disorder or someone who is
altered mental status,
severely inebriated,
psychiatric issues.
Yeah, under the influence of a drug. So,
and that becomes the only thing I would caution there is like that obviously has to be a decision that's made as a care team, right? Like a lot of times you have to have like 2 physician signatures, or or like have a social worker weigh in. I think sometimes we get really worked up around like, I know that I want to do this for the patient. I'm right. And you are. And the patient being irrationally like, no. Mm-hmm. I think it's worth pausing and saying like, the things that I want to do I have to do them right now or even at all? I've seen like physicians and nurses, like staff get into like insane fights with like psychiatric patients over things that just don't matter.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like, I don't know. I just, you just have to take that into consideration a little bit, I think.
Yeah. And I think too, like there have been patients before where like my team's been really upset. Like my guys have been real upset because they're like, he's going to have a STEMI. Like he's having a STEMI, like he's going to die. And I'm like, then just wait 5 minutes. Hey, when he goes unconscious, we'll fix him. It's implied consent then.
Right.
Like right now he doesn't want to, like he has a right to be stupid. You know, our mom used to say that to us all the time. You're old enough to be stupid is what she would say if you didn't want to wear a coat, because she was convinced we'd get a cold if we went out in the cold without a coat, which is a medical fallacy.
And she's a nurse.
So if you're listening, Mom,
you were wrong. We were right all along.
Anyway, you're old enough to be stupid. They can if they are, they have decisional capacity. They're A times 4. They're,
and just document like
mind.
Patient refuses this care and then move on and then do what you can do for them. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing either.
And wait outside their house until they pass out and then jump through the window. Do the act.
No, I don't know.
And then lastly, prisoners or arrestees. Technically speaking, the police have like durable power of attorney over whether or not they're going to receive care.
In certain
I have
things.
never met a cop that isn't just going to be like, yeah, they can go whatever they want and you can do whatever you want to them because they're so scared of getting into trouble. But you do have to, like, especially with like violent crime and stuff like that, like watch that. Because if you think that police officer is making a decision that's harmful to the patient, like he's refusing care for that patient and it would be harmful to the patient, like it is your responsibility to speak up and deal with that as a interdisciplinary team.
Yeah. Cool.
So that is all we've got. Oh, refusal of care is the last thing. If someone refuses, I don't really know why I have that in here. Refusal of care. Like
you can refuse.
They got to be of sound mind in order to refuse. You can refuse care. Make sure you get the proper documentation, or that you document the fact that they like walked off or something. But just cover your butt. You'll be good. That's medical legal. Dun 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 dun.
No,
that's Law and Order copyright TM.
We do not have access.
That is, I don't have access to
We're not allowed to have that. We're not allowed to say that.
Law and Order SVU.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. And hopefully this is a good overview of, and again, these things are there to protect you. And I think if we approach them that way and then obviously educate ourselves, which you've now done, congratulations, you're good to go. So now you can just go do whatever you want in medicine.
Nope.
All right,
that's
guys.
not true.
You guys have a great time.
Get your CE at guardiancme.com. Come visit us at booth 1172.
Nope, 1721.
1721. Look for the giant guardian head in the sky. We'll be shining it out.
I tell you
as
what,
our
if
bat
you
signal.
find our booth, we'll give you a water bottle just for finding the booth. We'll give you a Guardian branded water bottle if you can find our booth.
You're going to be able to find us. There's going to be a giant light in the sky. It wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be last year either.
Yeah.
So
All right, cool. All right, thanks, guys. Take care. We'll talk to you next time.
stay sweet.
Hey guys, thanks so much for taking a listen. If you are studying for the National Registry exam, we're here to help. We have a National Registry prep program to help you pass that exam. Check us out at guardiantestprep.com. If you'd like continuing education credits for listening to our podcast or watching this on YouTube, follow us at guardiancme.com. 100% free CAPC credits. No matter what state or country you're in, we're here to help. So again, we thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a wonderful week.